I think we are good to go, so we will get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for our second Zoom call featuring one of our medical advisory board members to share some of the amazing research underway for Koolen-de Vries syndrome. Also, a big hello to those of you watching through Facebook. We really appreciate you tuning in. Introductions first. I'm Casey, for those of you that I haven't met before, and I will be your hostess today on behalf of the Koolen-de Vries Syndrome Foundation. I am mom to Hudson, who is 9 and was diagnosed with KDVS just 3 years ago. I'm honored to share the Zoom screen with Dr. Angela Morgan, a speech pathologist and speech therapist that leads the Speech and Language Group at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and is a professor director of speech pathology at the University of Melbourne. Her current program of work is focused on understanding the genetic and brain basis of childhood speech and language disorder, in particular in children with apraxia of speech. She leads the National Health and Medical Research Council Center of Research Excellence in Speech and Language Neurobiology. In recent years, Angela has developed a passion for studying speech and language in children with rare genetic syndromes to optimize clinical outcomes and to improve prognostic counseling for families of affected children. Welcome. We're so happy to have you, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you so much.
For being here.
Thank
we
you
were
so
just
much.
talking about how it's dark in Nashville, Tennessee, and we're heading into the evening, and it's morning where Dr. Morgan is in Melbourne. So it's pretty neat that we can at least talk virtually tonight. So we're meeting today in large thanks to the KDVS Foundation and their commitment to educate, increase awareness, and promote research for the support and enrichment of individuals living with KDVS and their families. Thank you so much to the Foundation for making this possible today. If any of you watching want to learn more about the Foundation, please visit kdvsfoundation.org. So before we jump in, just a couple of other things. We want to do a bit of housekeeping. So thank you so much to all of you that submitted questions. They were absolutely wonderful. It made my job very easy because you guys asked everything. It was really awesome. So we are going to do our very best to get to as many of those questions as possible today. Please know that we have more calls coming in the future, so there may be an opportunity to address even more questions then with some of our other medical advisory board members. The call is being recorded, so we will share the link after the call via email and social media. And then time permitting at the end, we will try to take more questions. I don't know if we'll be able to because there were so many that were sent in ahead of time. But if you look to the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button, and you're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A. All right, so before we dive in and start asking questions and getting to know everything we can about Dr. Morgan's work, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on the history of the syndrome. We recognize that some of you may be very early in your KDVS journey and just beginning to learn, so this is just going to be really helpful context for you, and then we'll definitely get into it a lot more, especially as it relates to speech and feeding and all things of Dr. Morgan's world. Koolen-de Vries syndrome was first identified in 2006 and named after Dr. David Koolen and Dr. Bert de Vries. It is a genetic syndrome involving the 17th chromosome and is caused by a microdeletion, including the CANSL1 gene, or it is caused by a change or mutation of the CANSL1 gene. The microdeletion or the CANSL1 mutation causes developmental delays, learning difficulties, and can cause other health concerns as well. Many of our family members experience challenges with speech, so talking to Dr. Morgan today is very exciting for us. The prevalence of the microdeletion is now estimated at 1 in 55,000 individuals. Due to the limited number of identified mutations, at this time, the prevalence of the mutation cannot be determined, and more studies are required. You can learn more about the syndrome and all of the projects for research by visiting the Foundation website. So, speaking of research, we're going to get to know Dr. Morgan a little bit better. So, Dr. Morgan, I'll just ask you some questions, and you just feel free to share anything and everything that you can, and we'll just go from there until the timer tells us it's up. So does that work for you?
Thanks, Casey. Yeah, that's lovely. Thanks so much for organising this. And there are lots of lovely familiar people on the line, attendees. I've just had a look through. So lots of the wonderful families who I know well and who've taken part in the research. So thanks so much for joining.
We're so happy to have you. I thought it would be fun to just share a couple of fun facts about you before we get into some of the more serious parts of the conversation. And you had given us a little bit of an interesting fact, or actually a really interesting fact about yourself earlier in the week that we posted to social media about how you became interested in speech pathology as a 6-year-old. And I thought it would be really fun and just very interesting for everyone listening to hear about that and how you came into the field and what interested you about it.
That's really lovely. We'll be quick because I'm very boring compared to what we're going to talk about. But thank you for the interest. And yes, my brother, who's 4 years younger than me, 3 years younger than me, experienced speech difficulties as a child. And interestingly, so did my father and my grandfather. So even from a young age, I sort of worked those things out. And I guess that's where my thinking about genetics and speech conditions really started. But it was really lovely to go along and see the speech therapist work with my brother and make what he had to learn very explicit, and he really did gain in his confidence and his learning ability from having positive therapy, which was really lovely. So I think that was quite powerful, being such a young child, being exposed to that. And yes, I didn't really think about that a lot when I enrolled in my training, but it was only a little while after again that I remember those early experiences and how powerful they probably were. And my brother now works actually as a teacher of children with disability in Tasmania as well himself, which is really lovely. Yeah.
That's really amazing. And how long, one of the questions that came in, if you don't mind us asking, is how long have you been in this field of study?
Yes, that's another question. Yeah, so 23 years actually, which is quite a long time. Yes, so I worked in Australia for a time and then went to London, where I worked with the first family really to have been associated with a gene implicated in speech and language problems, a large family who had a gene variant, or spelling error as we call it, in the FOXP2 gene. And from there, that really made me see, okay, this is one family. This is a very rare condition. There have to be many, many more families out there and individuals who have speech and language challenges due to this type of gene change. And that's really what sparked the passion, which is still ongoing now. So I was working in London in 2004 onwards for a few years. And that's really where I saw the power of genetics to really tell you about a biological pathway. Because before that time, we'd see many children and people would say, well, will they talk? If they talk, will they speak typically? What does the prognosis look like? And without having that genetic or biological information, it's really been impossible to predict. Just environmental factors or your gender or some of these factors, they're just really not predictive enough to tell us anything. So, you know, I think, knowing the biology and understanding the genetic basis has been a huge development in our field, for then being able to work with families to map and understand communication and go from there to develop more targeted therapies rather than a very wait and see approach, which is sort of how many children are still treated actually. Yeah,
that's amazing. And I know we are going to get into a lot of conversation just around therapy and our cool individuals, especially because there were just so many great questions about that, to your point of just really trying to get targeted in our approach. Another question that we asked Dr. Khazri, and it was very popular, so it's back, is what are a couple of things that you can just tell us about yourself that are completely unrelated to science and research, but that are just interesting or fun facts about you?
Oh, so boring. I really like sport. I like sport. So exercise is definitely a way that I relax. And I've got 2 young boys, so it's great that that's something that I'm able to do and that I really enjoy. I really love swimming and swimming in natural swimming places. So in Australia, we're fortunate that's something we can do for many months of the year. And that's something I loved as a child, but I've really started getting back into that now. I guess they're 2 things. See, very boring.
No, I think that's really, I mean, we only have natural swimming in lakes, sometimes the ocean. So that sounds Sounds very lovely. So what's really interesting too is there's a lot of us probably on the call that at some point have had the opportunity to meet you in person and at one of the summits. And so I'm curious, as someone that's doing research and spending so much of your time in your career working towards this type of research and learning about the syndrome that impacts our loved ones, what's it like to go to a conference like that and meet the individuals and their families that you're researching about?
Yeah, it's a really nice question. It's incredibly powerful and rewarding and just very motivating to want to continue to understand more, to be able to try and help in some small way those families that we meet. So yeah, it's absolutely hands down the highlight of anything that we do, writing all of the grants and having papers rejected or having to rewrite papers, all of that doesn't matter as soon as you sort of get to come and meet with the families, because that's why you do it, and you wouldn't even think twice about all of those other negatives once you have those lovely experiences. So probably sounds corny, but it's just true.
Oh, that's amazing. I can remember, as I'm sure many who had the privilege of being there, just like furiously taking notes on everything I could possibly absorb as a parent over everything you all were saying. But I think, the other thing that's so neat is that when we do have the opportunity to bring these families together and you all are able to be there and we're able to actually participate in the research there, is really, really interesting. And so I think, kind of like what you're saying on the flip side of it, I feel like we as families really feel like we're getting to do something really special that's going to pave the way for other families in the future. So it's really an amazing partnership that we all get to work together, I think, in that way. So we're so thankful that you get to come. I know COVID is kind of messing us up a little bit right now, but at least we have a way to do all these things together virtually. So how did you first become involved with Dr. Koolen and Dr. De Vries and actually learn about the syndrome?
Yes, my colleague Professor Simon Fisher, who heads the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistic Research in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, he is somebody I worked with on the FOXP2 gene when I studied in London. Simon identified the FOXP2 gene, so he really works in the same field, but perhaps more like Nael around the basic science, the lab science. And Simon said to David and Bert, it looks like, or David and Bert rather might have approached Simon to say it looks like apraxia of speech and speech challenges are a core part of the condition. Simon said, I know somebody who would really love to work with you to better understand that condition. And Simon introduced me to Bert and David, Dr. Koolen and Dr. De Vries. And of course, they're both very inspiring, positive, hardworking people as well. So it was just a match made in heaven. And then when I got to meet all of the amazing families, well then, there was no stopping that collaboration again, because I do think that also you do have an excellent foundation and really lovely, respectful communication with the researchers as well. So that's been really easy to work with you all. But yes, nice to have met David and Bert through that connection with Simon.
It is. It's always really interesting to hear how you all get connected and kind of how that passion for learning more about the syndrome starts to arise. And everyone has a little bit of a different story, but it's just interesting to see you all connected and how well you all communicate with one another to continue to move the research forward. I think that's always really impressive to all of us. All right. So, kind of covered that question. Let me just make sure we're doing good covering some of the questions as we go. What do you find as you continue to learn more and more about Koolen-de Vries syndrome? What do you find most interesting in your research around this syndrome?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I think that one of the really interesting and lovely aspects has been the very sociable nature of the children. As we create, which again makes the meeting and coming together of families even more special. So that's been something that we've been thinking about in how to harness that to improve communication, because it actually is such an amazing strength that the children have. because for so many children, and I mean, I know everyone is still different and we have different profiles, but many children, they're not socially outgoing and they don't look for social interaction. And when that's the case, it's so hard to keep going in therapy and to make therapy something that the children are willing to do. Doesn't mean we don't still have days when kids don't want to have our therapy,
Right.
but it doesn't mean
Right.
we should work hard to make it fun and enjoyable. But that's certainly been one feature. And another feature has been the children's fascination and interest in music. Again, not everybody, but it has been quite a striking comment made over time. And so that's something we really wanted to try and harness in one of the therapy programs, because we thought it would be more motivating for the children than the old flashcards and other approaches that we often have. So that sort of led us into designing and thinking about a singing type therapy.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about that in a second, because that was something that also struck me. So when we were at the summit in Utah, there was this great panel where we had a lot of the teenage kids with Koolen-de Vries, and they probably don't want to be called kids anymore, the teenagers, get up and share. And we were asking, and whoever was hosting kept saying, what's your favorite subject in school? And of course, most of them said that they don't like math and all these other things, but they all commented on their love of the arts. I mean, it was overwhelmingly a theme that they liked music and they liked theater and art. So you're right, if there continue to be ways we can find to use those things they love already and how outgoing a lot of them are, that could be really valuable. So I'm excited to talk to you about that in a little more detail, because a lot of the parents asked questions about it. I think to kind of build up our foundation to discussing the research project, just a couple other things I wanted to ask you is, what are the most common, as you think about kind of, I guess, speech and language, and I know certainly we have to think about feeding, but what are some of the most common issues and challenges that you find with this population of people in this particular syndrome?
Yeah, that's a nice question. And actually, I guess I'm talking to evidence from our first paper from 2018 still today. However, I wanted to say that Mia St. John, our doctoral student, has worked again with many more families. So I think she has data on around 50 families, so that we'll be able to see whether we confirm the findings of the first paper, but also expand out a little bit what we've learned. But on the basis of the first paper, where we had 28 children and adolescents take part, the core things that we learned were, as you mentioned, Casey, in the early years, sort of due to the very low tone issues that we know about, that hypotonia, it's sometimes called very low tone, the infants often have difficulty feeding, and then often transitioning to lumpy textures and food can be difficult. And then that oral motor system, as we call it, is sort of the precursor for how we develop speech and language. And then that's when we see those next challenges. So children often have a little bit delayed first words. So you often will see onset of first words more like 18 months rather than 12 months. But then it's that combination of two words that's then very challenging. And in many children, you sort of see that from 2 to 3 years of age, you'll get two words together. But again, some of those trajectories are pushed out. Now, the fantastic thing is, the kids do get there with intensive therapy, but of course it's a lot of work building up sounds, learning those sounds, building those sounds into words, getting the phrases. You know, we know it's hard work, but the amazing thing to keep heart with is that the kids can get there. But those preschool years, because of that low tone, and then because of the apraxia of speech, the speech praxis, that's where the children know what they want to say, but their brain isn't able to quickly coordinate the lip and tongue movements and also the voicing to have speech that is sequenced in the right sequence, that happens quickly and automatically, as it does for people who don't experience the condition. And also the stress patterns of speech as well. So because you're struggling to get out and to sequence those sounds and to do that really quickly, thinking then about how the stress patterns and sing-song pattern of your voice is really tricky. And then what we find is when the children have worked really hard and the speech praxis is resolving and you're getting the words out and you're getting the phrases, then it's a bit frustrating sometimes, because you've got the underlying muscle weakness is sort of still there. and that's the dysarthria. And fewer therapists talk about dysarthria because we spend so much time building up the sounds and working on that and getting the words, and they're pretty much great. But then it is just the rate of speech, the precision, and again, sometimes that prosodic pattern isn't just quite, finely tuned. It's still a little bit altered or a bit different to our peers. In the middle school years onwards. So that's another area we're interested in trying to see if we can tighten that up. And as you nicely said before, Casey, yeah, the teenagers, maybe at that point, that's where they might like to optimise their speech and try and develop some home-based therapies or interventions, so they're not always having to be dragged out to another adult. And, they've got this association of all those years of childhood speech therapy. They're social media gurus, they're telling us how to work the technology at home. Let's try and work out some therapies where they can be self-driven and self-directed and have that more autonomy with the program. So, yeah, that's where it's lovely that in Koolen-de Vries, if we work really hard, for many of the kids, we can get the speech sounds going and the speaking going, but it's that never stopping in a way, but how can we develop therapies that can then refine the dysarthria? But yes, I'd say the apraxia and the dysarthria are the core features. And then for some of the adolescents in particular, we've noticed a handful of individuals experience stuttering or stammering, or disfluency. They're sort of the three terms that you hear, but they're all synonyms and they mean the same thing. Sometimes the disfluency is linked in with apraxia and initiation of speech, and it's that largely the speech is great, but every now and then there is a breakdown in initiation that appears like a disfluency. And then for other children, it doesn't seem just like the apraxia-initiated disfluency. It seems more like a true stutter where you're getting stuck on certain sounds. So you've made the start of the word, but you're blocking, and you'll repeat that sound or a syllable over and over, or you'll repeat a few words of the phrase over and over. And that's something that Mia St. John, my doctoral student, we've just revised our ethics actually to come back to some families who we've already been working with. If you've taken part in Mia's most recent study, yes, we feel like that's something that needs pursuing a little more because it's distressing when it happens. And there are some good therapies out there for managing stuttering. But what exactly is the nature of the stuttering that the children are experiencing, and therefore what sorts of therapies would be best? And particularly in the teenage and adult years, there are fewer therapies that are proven, evidence-based proven therapies, but still some, and some that we could try to target to the sorts of stuttering experiences we're seeing in the children. So yeah, that's something that's a little newer, but that, as I said, yes, we know it can cause great distress. So we're trying to probe further to see what we can learn.
And what are other things, as you think about the speech difficulties, and you kind of maybe answered some of this, but I'm just thinking families might be thinking, okay, as you obviously the speech piece, and then there's the feeding piece, and then a lot of our families may have to worry about choking, and there's just kind of all these things that sort of go together. And I'm just wondering too, if you could speak to it all, any of the clinical diagnoses neurologically or physically that also cause some of these challenges that might be helpful for us to understand, what happens to these kids right at birth that's already kind of setting them up to have these challenges with their speech, et cetera.
Yes. No, that's a really important question. So yes, Casey, what we hypothesize, because it's not proven, but we're doing some brain imaging research with Dr. Ken Myers as well, our neurological colleague in Canada, who again fortuitously just happened to be working with a leading epileptologist in my home city of Melbourne for many years. So Ken had already been working with my other colleagues here in town, and then we had the nice link now of also each working on Koolen-de Koolen-de Vries Syndrome, because Ken, of course, has helped characterise seizures and epilepsy. So what we think is happening with Koolen-de Vries, and particularly with the cancel-1 gene within the deletion, where we know some children have variants or spelling errors, if you like, just in cancel-1. The other children have the broader deletion syndrome. But from work that Dr. de Vries and Dr. Koolen had done, it looks like it's the cancel-1 gene that's perturbed or affected more that leads to the phenotype or the features that we see.
Right.
And it seems as something that happens, and we know this from other conditions, genetic causes of apraxia, that gene change then, or the microdeletion syndrome, has implications for embryological development and development of brain regions in particular that are supporting speech and language development and then feeding development. So we haven't been able to definitively show this yet, although of course Dr. de Vries and Nail's team and many of the other researchers are looking at a lab level what happens with the gene change at a cellular level and also at neuronal firing, which I think you've probably had some talks on this in the past.
Yeah.
Yes, but we're studying some of the children and adolescents who have Koolen-de Vries and studying the brain imaging findings from those children and adolescents. And it seems like what we would hypothesise is it's the motor strip or motor part of the brain. Sorry, that's the postman, but he's left the post. That's why I looked a bit distracted then. The things that happen on our home Zooms. The children are at school. I could control them today, but I can't control the postman. Sorry about that. So the motor cortex, it's called, so the part of your brain that controls, hand movement, speech movement, feeding. We're hypothesising that perhaps there are differences in the way those brain structures are developing or how they're functioning. So you think about functional magnetic resonance imaging studies too, where you're talking in the brain scanner and looking at how brain lights up to see whether or not there are differences in the way the brain is functioning. So that's the hypothesis, that it's challenges or differences in the way the brain is growing and developing that then mean it just takes that bit of extra work to compensate, to harness any plasticity of the brain, to sort of, optimise speech and language learning, because something has occurred through that biological change with the microdeletion syndrome or the gene change that then has led to differences in brain development, which means that's why speech for some of the other siblings in the family or other kids just kind of happens. It's an unstoppable force, whereas for our kids, something's already altered there and we need to really work harder to get that trajectory going. But it's frustrating we don't have evidence yet, and we started scanning some children last year and we're due to scan a further handful this year, but due to COVID, our brain scanner institute shut down. And so we're hoping now that things are a little more positive locally at the moment. We don't know, things change all the time, don't they? But that we could, some lovely engaged families who've already been lined up might continue to take part in that work. Because yes, I think that really helps families and the children and adolescents themselves understand why is it taking so much extra work to really make those links. You don't just go from genes to talking, as you say. What's the neurological link? That's sort of gene, brain, speech development. So lovely question, and that's what we're thinking, and that's what we know, and we can draw analogies from other conditions we work with where this is what occurs. For other kids with apraxia, the gene change occurs, altered brain development just takes that extra bit of work to get the speech and language development going.
That's very helpful. We've talked a little bit just in the questions I've asked about some of the research so far, but I think if you could tell those listening just, in addition to some of the things you've learned already, anything we haven't discussed that you are learning in your research, just some of the current projects you have going on. I think people are always excited to know what we might be able to learn in the future that could help us get more intentional around the type of therapies that we're using. So I'll give you some time just to share with us what you've learned and what's currently ongoing that we haven't already discussed.
Fantastic. Thanks, Casey. I'll bring up my slides, but I guess today I was still focusing a little bit on the speech production aspects. But one thing I wanted to, I guess, give a shout out about is also, and many families are already doing this and therapists are great, is that we spend so much time emphasising the production of speech, but how important understanding speech sounds and still reading and literacy aspects are. And that's called phonological awareness or sound awareness. And that's the real building block for literacy. And I know another nice finding is that one of the families had shared with me that their children had sort of online readers when they were younger. I mean, now everything's online or we have iPads, but that there would often be text supporting listening to those stories and readers, and that many of the children can harness that visual representation. And that some of the children, they have fantastic reading earlier than they can get their speech going because they've had all of that lovely exposure to letters, to writing, to signs, to symbols. So I suppose that's just one thing that, you know, yeah, every time you read that book or you have a nursery rhyme or you're doing the singing along, all of that is absolutely so valuable. In addition to, of course, then the more drill-based work that we like to do in speech therapy to get the sounds going. But I suppose that's the overarching thing I wanted to get across, because we focus a lot on speech. But yeah, for literacy, just having all of those exposures. And then I'll just bring up my slides. So excuse me for a moment while I do that. Won't be a second. Just pop them up there. So what's the time across the span of the US of families we've got on today, Casey? If we're going right across the US, what would the...
Yeah, we're kind of all over the place. But so it's 5:30 p.m. Central Time in Nashville. So I'm on Central Time. So we've got probably Eastern, Pacific, Mountain Time. So we're kind of all over. A lot of people probably in the dinner time area, I would guess. Is it 11 p.m. your time?
It's 10:30 here.
10:30, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Fantastic. Can you see the...
I can. Yeah, that's great.
Slide. Yeah, so that was just to say this is my main institution, but I also am a professor at University of Melbourne. So this is where Mia, my doctoral student, and I sit up in this building when we're allowed into work outside of COVID times. And you're all over here, of course. So... and here's a lovely young lady we might recognise. And just to say, as you nicely said before, Casey, there is a spectrum or a continuum of areas that we talk about and that we're working on. But today I was going to focus again a little bit more on the speech areas that we sort of talked about. And I think we've sort of covered some of these issues. So those early feeding challenges, real difficulty producing vowels and consonants, inconsistency of speech. So you might say the same word a few times, but it might sound quite different each time. So for helicopter, helitopper, heyotta, hepiotta, which really makes it hard to predict children's speech patterns. Those prosodic errors, whether you've got excessive stress or equal stress, banana, different ways of stressing words. And then there's disfluency. So in that first study we had just 3 of the individuals had experienced disfluency, but we didn't really ask a lot about disfluency at that time. That's why we're going back to ask more about stuttering. And I guess some of these features are a little more apraxic type features, but with the dysarthria I talked about before, so that's that low tone, hypotonia. That really affects movement and the coordination and ability to move your articulators, the lips and tongue, control oral nasal sounds. So we have many sounds are oral, but some are nasal, and you're actually, during typical speech, moving the little soft palate at the back of your throat up and down to signal oral and nasal resonance without even thinking about it. But for our children with dysarthria or apraxia, this is another challenging feature. So you might have overly nasal speech because you might have the port closed more often than you should or open more often. Even breath support for speech, respiration. Have you even got enough breath support to get out longer phrases? And then how do you coordinate your voicing, phonation? Have you got good voice quality? Is your voice a bit raspy? Is it a little bit tremulous? When you've got underlying weakness, that can be tricky. So these are some of the ways some of the features that you might have if you're a bit got that low tone going. And so, as we sort of said before, in our therapy in the preschool years, you're really focused on building up from sounds, syllables into words. That's really a lot of drill work in the preschool years. And then once we get that speech in the middle school years, sometimes we have less of a speech focus, and often speech pathologists are not sure how to manage dysarthria. We don't have a really good evidence base. Yeah.
While you're just talking about the early preschool, you know, it feels like just with the advancement of the study of genetics and just that it's a lot easier, I feel like, or at least it seems it is, to get genetic testing. So we're starting to hear of more children being diagnosed at a very early age, even at birth, where a lot of us, our kids were older. So when would you say is the right time to start speech for these kiddos that are getting diagnosed at birth? You know?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would get in as soon as you could. So it's not atypical or unusual for us to see children at 6 months of age, you know, and to be advising families on sorts of oral play and how to encourage communication interactions. So it's different in every state. It's different with everybody's insurance, and these things are difficult.
Right.
But absolutely, you can get in there and get going at 6 months. It won't be the same type of intensive therapy we see, of course, in our infants and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, etc. But it just gets you primed and honed in on what you're going to be looking for the future. And there are some things that you could work on. Now, it's easy to say, go for it at 6 months. There are so many other things we might be managing medically. So, of course, that's just an encouragement. The sooner the better. But you will be juggling feeding, you'll be juggling health, you'll be trying to get some sleep. So some of these things are always more important for everyone. You've got another child, so, you know, don't feel that that's a pressure thing and you have to do it. But I suppose if you're able and it's possible, you could engage with a speech therapist as early as 6 months, but you won't be doing a lot of intensive regular work. It'll just be to start, even if it's just once every few weeks, to meet with them and learn some techniques to encourage communication.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Casey. Great questions. And so I suppose some of the therapies that Mia and I had focused on, we felt that apraxia, there are many researchers working in apraxia. We still don't have an armament of really rigorously proven therapies in apraxia, but the field is further on for developing those than they are for dysarthria. And because of the rare nature of Koolen-de Vries, where our families are also spread out, apraxia therapy is often better, as you know, with prompts and cues and to have that child right there with you. Now, we've all had to move to telehealth this year because of COVID, and actually that's been good for making speech pathologists upskill in how might we be able to work with young people without great attention spans through a computer. So we're improving in that way. But I suppose pre-COVID, when we were thinking about home-based interventions or reaching children with Koolen-de Vries around the world, we thought dysarthria and the older kids might be a good place to start. So that's just the background there. And this is a lovely young man who some of us might know, who has beautiful speech now. There's just that overlay of the dysarthria there. So I thought, if it's all right, we might play a clip, and I'm very grateful to the family for allowing me to do that just in Koolen-de Vries forums. I see this lovely family are online today.
Get ready for adventure. Get ready for adventure. Get ready for adventure.
So fantastic speech. All of those sounds are spot on. And it's just a little bit prosody, you know, we could maybe sharpen up, etc. There are a few things maybe, but I mean, such a wonderful young man and has worked hard and has fantastic speech, but it sort of gives that, you know, there's not the apraxia there. We've got all of our speech and we said that really beautifully and automatically, but are there things we can do to continue to refine our speech even further? And just one thing to think about when we go back to our local clinicians, and I'm always happy to have communication and support any of our families with and the local clinicians, many of whom are fantastic, but sometimes you just, you know, you really want to make sure, and if you're questioning them, They should be able to give you the answers, and a great clinician should never be defensive about answering why they've chosen an approach. But it's just to think about when you ask them, oh, what sort of evidence is there for this approach? There is a pyramid of, you know, from expert opinion right up to systematic reviews, where you take all of the evidence that is available in the literature and appraise that very carefully using a very rigorous approach. And it was just to say that we've used this most rigorous approach for apraxia across all conditions, not just Koolen-de Vries.
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to, but this is just triggering because I have my list of questions from the parents, and they're just, they're matching beautifully. Because we got a lot of questions from parents around just talking to therapists in general, of just, you know, what you actually say and how much information should you give them about Koolen-de Vries syndrome. And they were just asking for your advice. And I think, first of all, hearing that you're available is awesome. But just, if you could just share with the parents how you would advise them on that, that would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's challenging because you notice that clinicians use these terrible terms all the time and things, and it can be a bit intimidating. You know, I saw one person give a talk, and to parents they were talking about diadochokinesis, which is just when we get the kids to say padaka, 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 which is something we're obsessed with because it looks at how we control syllables and things. And I was thinking, well, you know, I had to learn that over 4 years of training. Don't say diadochokinesis to a family. But anyway, so we all have different awareness and insights ourselves as clinicians about what's important. But I suppose I would encourage the clinicians to read the paper that we had written in 2018, which I know the foundation has a copy of, because it does really pull out what the core features might be for the children. Of course, each child's then a little different at where they're at, but it will really help the clinicians, instead of doing this trial and error approach, and we'll try this for a while, now we'll try that. It should help them to understand, oh, this will be a speech motor condition, and speech motor is apraxia and dysarthria. So that's one way to go about it. And I think when you're talking to the clinicians, you just say, you know, feel confident to ask, what are the best therapies at this age that could be used with my child? How do we know they're the best therapies? What evidence is there for those therapies? Do you know if the evidence has been used in children with similar abilities in the past? So don't be scared to ask those questions. A good clinician should say, yeah, great question. And yes, we don't have much evidence is often the frustrating answer, but they should be willing to work with you. What are your goals? What do you want to achieve? What do you think your child or adolescent wants to achieve? Let's work on it together. I think this might be the best approach. What do you think? So that's the current best model of evidence. What does literature say? What is your clinician trained in and confident and competent at? And what do the family want to achieve? We call it E3PD, the 3 pinnacles of evidence-based practice. Yeah. But I'm always happy to answer people's individual questions about these kinds of things.
Okay.
And then for dysarthria, it's a similar story. So for apraxia, there's only one currently published randomised control trial, but lots of new studies happening in the literature of different approaches, which is terrific. But with dysarthria, there's still not any randomised control trial proven treatment. So for those people who mightn't be familiar with different types of trials, a randomised trial where children are just randomised to one group or another, where you've also got a control group, is scientifically the most, the highest pinnacle of evidence, if you like. So that's what we're always striving for in our science. But at the moment in dysarthria in paediatrics, we don't have one in Koolen-de Vries, but in any condition. So this is something that different groups are working towards. The other thing to really think about with speech therapy, and particularly for our kids with Koolen-de Vries and teens with Koolen-de Vries, it's very much this movement condition. So you really can liken it to a high performance athlete. If you're thinking about somebody training and wanting to, say, do the high jump and the number of times it takes to perfect the high jump, have a plan in your head of how you want to achieve this, many experiences of practice, feeling what success feels like, the whole muscle memory, if you like, of a movement like that. And that's what we're doing for speech as well. It's called motor learning principles, and it's only through that repetition and practice and using these principles that we can harness plasticity in the brain and learn or compensate depending what we need to do. So I know there's a lot of information here, but it's just to sort of, again, make you think about the therapy perhaps that you're receiving and, you know, empower you to maybe ask therapists, oh, do you think we're doing enough repetitions? How much practice are we doing? Do you think we're doing enough practice? The types of practice you're doing, the variability. Are you just working on the F sound for 6 months, or are you working on different sounds? Now, we still don't have the perfect formula or recipe of you should do this many trials at this stage, and it depends on your child's age and the stage of development, but this sort of gives you the language or some of those points to think about. So I know it'll be too quick today to take all of this in, but this is giving you this information for future to think about. And then just to talk about how we've designed our therapies, I suppose this is a background to quickly getting an update on what we've done, because I know we're sort of getting out of time. And the other important thing is, what type of knowledge of performance for the child do you get given? So does the therapist say to the child after every production, that was good or that wasn't right, or do they give it randomly? So again, these are the sorts of different ways in which we can structure treatment, and it's good to ask clinicians about why they're working in the way they're working. So where are we up to? Yes, we've mentioned the karaoke and the cool kids a few times.
Yes, excited about this.
Which is great. And this is Mia, who some of you might have met at Salt Lake City. These are her beautiful slides. And this is her other clinical genetics supervisor, David Amor, and then myself. So Mia had developed this singing therapy. We had trialled it in our group with another group of children with a different condition known as Dravet syndrome as well. And when we were thinking about designing it, we were thinking about the dysarthria, the low tone. We wanted to have a good evidence-based trial. We were thinking about this being based at home, and we wanted to make it fun and capitalise on something that's a wonderful feature of many individuals with Koolen-de Vries, which is the sociability and the music and the performance, as Casey was nicely saying before. We wanted to make it a home-based therapy because it's a rare condition. We wanted to reach as many kids as we could. And then these were just some of the other reasons why it would be nice to develop an online therapy. Families don't have to travel with a sort of minimise cost. And we know from other work that other children, or adults rather, with dysarthria, this type of approach has been shown to work well. So I think we've sort of talked about the singing-based therapy. We talked about dysarthria before, and breath support and phonation. It does really target some of these areas of dysarthria. It also gives you oral, the hearing, and the visual feedback as well. So biofeedback is really helpful for children in trying to again, independently control their own body systems and learn, like we were saying about that high performance athlete before. This is a way that children are using those similar biofeedback principles for themselves. Yeah, and that we're using these motor-based principles, and the main ones we're using are a large amount of practice. We've got more variable practice, so we don't just do the same sound all the time or the same feature of a song all the time. We're looking at different features. We're looking at more complex movements because it's easier for kids to generalise from therapy if they've been doing more complex movements. And we give the children knowledge of results, not just knowledge of performance here. So we just wanted to see, could it even be done? Because we had to post out the SingStar to people, etc. You know, how feasible was this? And also, of course, we're aiming to improve intelligibility of speech. Can we actually improve how easy it is to understand the children. And we also are thinking all the time about better outcome measures, we call them, better speech tests that are very objective and reliable, because if Dr. De Vries and Dr. Koolen and Nail and others develop drug therapies, we want to go into drug trials and we want to have really robust measures for speech outcomes. So in all the work we do, we also embed some other tasks that the kids might find a bit funny, prolonged R's and that pa sort of task I did before. But these are nice objective tasks that we can measure very well with acoustic measurements. And then we just, most importantly, was this even fun? Was it easy to use? Did the families find it a pain? You had to go to the post office if you missed the postie to pick up the thing. We had one dear family, one of our favourite families, they got a microwave delivered instead of the SingStar. I mean, this is crazy. So, this is probably not great in terms of feasibility, but never mind. So thanks to the families for sticking with us through all of this to see, is this even worthwhile? We would just, for a feasibility study, you only have a small number of kids. So, and we were looking for those older kids, like we said before, the apraxia had to be sort of kind of a bit resolved, and the dysarthria more a core feature here. The kids had to be able to read or be able to hold in working memory the songs. And it was a randomised controlled trial. That's a bit boring, but you could have a look at that later, which just means we tried to design it very rigorously. And the kids were doing 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week for 4 weeks. So what's that, 16 sessions. And they got to choose their own songs. And so we've only got one more participant to be enrolled. So Mia had nearly finished the trial and then COVID hit, and all of our families understandably thought this is just too much at this time to take on with everything else we're doing.
Yeah.
So we'll have the results very soon. Mia's just reaching out, I think, to recruit some more families again now. Yeah.
That's exciting. Because I'm guessing, like you said, 10 to 18, one of the questions we got too was just trying to think about, well, we got this question a lot, therapies for all these different age ranges, and, how to keep them, as you mentioned in the beginning, engaged over time and continuing to adapt. And so that's really neat, because it feels like maybe that would be something, given that it could be 10 to 18, that you could do over a wide age range.
Yes, I think for children who really love music and were motivated by that area, that would be something that would be a good one. And yeah, it's just around then still at an individualized level working out what your particular targets are. So the platform itself could be adapted. But I suppose one thing I've wondered about, and only Mia's results will tell us, and it's too small to say really definitively, but it'll give us a bit of an indication, and families will say, do you think it made a difference or not? We'll get a bit of information on that, is whether that was targeted enough. Because in songs and in these areas, it's not like you're really saying, okay, now we're going to work on only phonation, or now we're going to work, you don't sort of break it down much. It's very much the gestalt of the whole song. So that's why we've developed another therapy to trial. And what we sort of have to do here is we're doing a couple of small trials, because when you then apply for grant bodies to think about taking the work further and adapting it more to kids and across the different age ranges, etc., you really need very good pilot data, we call it. And so that's why we're doing another small trial. Hopefully that will be Mia, but she's only got a year left of her doctoral thesis. And it depends how we all go with COVID. Because yes, at different times in our different regions around the world, we have more to juggle than others. And so Who knows what 2021 brings? Yeah. But this program, again, we wanted to improve intelligibility of speech, and we want to look at feasibility. How feasible is this? And this one, I think, is even more potentially interesting, or it might push teenagers who really want to focus on their speech a little bit more. Again, it requires a bit of equipment, a Galaxy tablet, which we would send out to the families. We'd do therapy 4 days a week for 4 weeks. And there will be assessments before and after therapy, just 30-minute sessions typically. And again, it's designed to improve vocal control, prosody, intelligibility. So it's more a dysarthric assessment or a dysarthric treatment. And again, principles of motor learning. So again, it's individualised. It will be based on the child's profile that we see. 30 minutes. I've got 3 times a week there, but I think we were going to try for 4. Sorry. And then what you sort of get is little instructions. Now, we would like to have more funding to make this even more beautiful looking, and yes, the kids are so up with technology, and some of these things I think are a bit daggy is our word here. I'm not sure what another US term would be, but I guess these are very targeted. So, and we have to simplify the instructions a little bit. So this is one of my adult examples. But what you get are examples of graphs. So they tell the child, oh, look, yesterday you could go for this long when you said but today you could go for longer. Oh, your volume was louder yesterday, but today your volume's quieter. So we're breaking these down to make them simpler for younger children. Again, these are adult graphs. But the child gets to see the feedback on the screen. They can see how loud they are. Then they get a little graph to say, oh, you were better yesterday. So it kind of gets that competitive nature going for the kids as well.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there. Sorry, I know that was a whirlwind tour.
No, that's so helpful, because it's, a lot of the questions and a lot of the questions we've gotten, and I think you've really kind of answered as we've talked along the way, but are just, I think people are so hungry for what is the best therapy, and it feels like right now, as we continue to wait for more research, it's really talking with your therapist, asking the right questions, kind of, I hate to say pushing, but just really trying to get to the heart of what's out there that's best. But it feels like a lot of the research you're doing now could further answer in a more specific way down the road, this is the targeted therapy you should be doing. Because if I'm hearing you right, we don't exactly know that for 100% certainty yet, but hopefully we'll have more of that certainty as research is completed. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair, yes. And everything just builds on the previous research. And I know it's really frustrating for families. And I know as much as we get to the point of understanding programs that are likely better than others, there's still always that individual component as well. So it still does require the expertise of your local clinician who's working directly with your child to map all of their strengths and then their greater challenges, and then to work out the best program. But I think by educating families about all of the things to keep in mind and think about, and it is really hard, isn't it? You're always the advocate for your child. You've always got to keep your eye on lots of these different areas and ask those questions, and it can be very exhausting. But most clinicians are willing to go on that journey with you and learn, and I think they're always receptive to the scientific articles that will try and help guide them. But as you say, Casey, it is about trying to develop treatments that might be optimised or, most suitable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but there are a couple other questions that I just think are very important for you to answer before we do wrap up. Is there at any point that you would say if speech hasn't come that it won't, or is it something that a family could always continue to work towards with some level of hope that it might?
That's a really important question. It depends on a few different factors. So in my experience, I've even worked with individuals with, say, a brain injury who were non-verbal for 13 years and then with the right tailored therapy got speech going. Now, for genetic conditions, the main things to look out for are learning ability. So are we talking about a profound intellectual disability? Are we talking about severe, moderate, etc.? If you sort of have a broader learning capacity, there should be the ability there to produce speech. Sometimes we are unlucky and we don't only have Koolen-de Vries. We might have what we call a second hit, and you might have another gene that has a variant or a mutation or spelling error, however we want to call it. And so for some of us, we've got Koolen-de Vries, but we might have some other gene change. Now, usually that would have been detected. So there's probably nothing new to see here, and it mightn't affect many of us, but that would be one question I would ask. So are there other genes implicated that might mean 2 lots of genes implicated? It's going to be harder for us to get speech going. The other question is around that general learning ability. So we know riding a bike is tricky. We know handwriting is tricky. The whole motor system is a bit implicated, but learning is still possible. We can get to play soccer. We can do these things. But if our general learning is broader than just this motor learning, and we've got lots and lots of other profound intellectual disability, really, really severe, that's harder. That can be harder, but only working with your psychologist, your local clinical geneticist, paediatrician, to work out what do you think learning capacity is here, that then informs speech and language learning capacity too. So it won't just be your speech pathologist who can make that decision for you. It should be a whole team to help. But I've seen many children who are still non-verbal, 9, 10, 11, and with the right input and just things come together for them neuronally, and we can affect some change. Or we decide, okay, we're going for an augmentative or alternative multimodal communication system. Let's go for, iPads and devices are becoming more socially acceptable, pro loquo to go. There are some better devices. We're getting better at these sorts of electronic devices. So we keep heart there. We mightn't be able to get the motor system going, but are there other systems we can use?
And the last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap, and you walked me right into it, is just those devices. That was one of the questions, is just at what point should you use them? Should you at all? So if you could just speak to that really quickly before we wrap up, I think that would be really valuable for those who do have nonverbal children.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were always hesitant, aren't we, to use those devices, because we think the most naturalistic, it is the way that we think about communication is to use our voice. The evidence, interestingly, tells us it's great to use those devices. The use of those devices doesn't stop or impair your ability to use speech. What those devices do is encourage language learning, encourage your vocabulary, maybe allow the child to point and get 2 words out, or a phrase, recorded phrases out. So the evidence suggests it just will help all that underlying language and literacy ready for, if we can prime and get this speech motor system going. So it's giving your child a voice before they can grow their own voice, I guess. Yeah. But I understand the hesitations and the challenges, and not all clinicians are as skilled with these as others. You've really got to shop around. It's a really tough one.
Yeah, well, I know we're at time, or just a couple minutes over, but we knew that this would be such an important conversation, and that so many parents would have questions. And so you all have heard Dr. Morgan is just wonderful to talk to, and full of knowledge, and really willing to help us. And so if you have additional questions that we just couldn't get to tonight because of time, and you may have even more after hearing about the great research, please feel free to send those to the foundation. And if it's okay with you, Dr. Morgan, we'll do our best maybe to put a few more questions in an email to you, and see if that might help. We want to really thank you all tonight, just for your interest and your participation. Of course, a huge thank you to Dr. Morgan and to the Koolen-de Vries Foundation for making this possible. Please visit the foundation website, kdvsfoundation.org, to learn more about the foundation and just the amazing research projects that are going on. I hope this brings you as much hope as it does me to hear that there are so many amazing and very, very smart people working to get answers that we want for our loved ones. So we are so thankful we got to connect with each of you tonight. We look forward to talking to you again, and just wish all of you a happy holiday season. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you so much. Great to see everyone. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.